A child was born on a world where the storms never stopped. The Iktochi homeworld sat in the outer rim, surrounded by permanent cyclones that scraped the surface like claws. The winds never calmed, the sky never cleared. And yet, deep within the storm, an ancient people endured, known across the galaxy, not for their strength, but for something else entirely. They saw the future. It began as whispers, flickers, dreams they could not forget. And among them, there was one girl whose visions came too soon, and far too clearly. She saw death in the wind, fire in the skies, the screams of people she had never met, dying in wars that had not yet begun. She was 6 years old. No one taught her how to see. No one told her what the voices meant. But from the moment she could speak, her mind began to fracture under the weight of futures that weren't hers. Her name is lost now, swallowed by time, but the pain of her childhood echoes still, through the life she became, through the mask she wore, through the Sith she would later be called. But before the darkness, she was only a child, and her mind was a battlefield. On Iktoch, visions were common, but hers were different. While others saw impressions of movement, of light, of choices, she saw precision. Exact images, deaths with names, wars with dates. She described battles with clarity beyond belief, and she never smiled. They brought her to the elders, hoping she could be trained, hoping the clarity could be refined like a tool. But the elders could do nothing, because what she saw terrified them. She predicted the death of one of her caretakers, not just the moment, the cause, the ship that would fail, the body they would not find. It happened 6 weeks later, exactly as she had seen. After that, the village no longer welcomed her. They whispered that her visions were not natural, that they were poisoned, perhaps by the dark side, perhaps by something worse. She was still only a child, but the way they looked at her changed. She was not one of them anymore. She was something to be feared. She stopped speaking. She began to draw, and in those drawings, scratched into walls and carved into stone, she showed the galaxy burning, Jedi falling by the hundreds, red blades rising where peace had once stood, planets torn apart not by war, but by something far colder. She drew the rule of 2 before it existed. She etched the eyes of Bane before he was born. The visions did not stop, but her questions did. She no longer asked why, no longer wondered who the faces belonged to, because somewhere, deep inside her silence, she had accepted a truth no one else could bear. She would never grow old on Iktoch. She would never become a seer for the Republic. Her life was not meant for peace or for prophecy. It was meant for destruction. And though she did not yet know the word, she was already being shaped by it. Every dream she couldn't escape, every death she couldn't prevent, they were not warnings, they were preparation. Because one day she would stop seeing the future and begin creating it. The dreams did not fade, they grew sharper. By the time she was 9, sleep was no longer a place of rest, it was a prison of fire. Entire systems burning in silence. Children taken from their homes, Jedi turning against Jedi. Every night she walked through the ruins of the future, unable to look away. Some nights she screamed. Other nights she didn't wake at all. They moved her to a small outpost high in the mountain ranges of Iktoch, far above the other settlements. Isolated, watched. They called it protection, but she understood what it truly was. Containment. They feared her more with each passing year. Not because she was violent, she had never raised her voice, never harmed a soul, but because her visions were never wrong. People she described always vanished. Buildings she drew always collapsed. and her eyes no longer blinked when she saw death. She had seen too much to be afraid anymore. There were rumors that she had stopped dreaming of her own people, that her visions had crossed the stars to distant systems, to temples hidden underground, to towers that reached above the clouds. In secret, she began sketching the shape of a pyramid. The dark stone, the open sky, the red lights flaring in the distance. It was not something anyone on Iktoch recognized. But across the galaxy, long buried beneath the Valley of the Dark Lords, a place just like it waited to be found. Korriban. She had never heard the name, but it lived inside her, like a memory not yet formed. She drew the statues of Sith she did not know. She whispered names that would not be recorded in the archives for centuries. Names like Andedu, Ragnos, Sado, Nihilus. Always the ones who endured after death. She did not understand what they meant, only that they were calling to her. The other Iktochi began to avoid her completely. Some believed she was possessed. Others believed she was cursed. But deep inside her, she began to feel something new, something colder than fear. Purpose. One day, she stood in the wind for 6 hours, unmoving. She watched the clouds twist into shapes only she could see. And when she finally spoke, she said a name. Bane. She didn't know what it meant. No one around her did. It was another name spoken too early. Another truth pulled from a timeline not yet written. But it marked a shift. From that day forward, she stopped recording visions of disasters. She began recording people, faces she would one day meet. The man with armor of obsidian, bound in hatred. The woman with scars hidden behind red eyes. The boy born in war, raised in peace, fated to fall. And a shadow quiet, formless, always watching, her own. She was dreaming of her future. For the first time, she saw herself standing at the center of death, not warning of it, but commanding it. The realization changed her. She began to speak again, but not with fear, with knowledge. She started asking about hyperspace, about the core worlds, about the Sith. And when the elders refused to answer, she began planning her escape. She was still only a child, but her eyes no longer held innocence, they held flame. And from that fire, something ancient stirred. The Force no longer whispered warnings, it began offering paths. Dark ones, clear ones, and always they ended in death. Not hers. She escaped in the middle of the night. No one saw her leave. No one tried to stop her. The girl, whose visions had once paralyzed an entire village, simply walked into the storm, her small silhouette swallowed by lightning and wind. There was no ceremony, no goodbye, just silence. And somewhere beyond the mountains of Iktoch, a ship descended, old, rusted, and half forgotten. It was not a Republic vessel, not military, not marked. But she had seen it before, in her dreams. A trader, a smuggler, a man who owed debts he could never repay. She knew exactly where he would be, and exactly what he would do. When he saw her standing on the ridge, he hesitated. She did not speak. She only stared at him like she had always known him. And when he finally let her aboard, she said nothing more than a single name. Malachor. It meant nothing to him, but he flew anyway. She was 10 years old when she left her world. 10 years old and already hunted by the truth. Her path took her through nameless ports, pirate rings, silent stations in the mid-rim, always alone, always moving. The galaxy was larger than she imagined, louder, more chaotic, but none of it surprised her, because she had seen most of it before. It was during this time that she stopped dreaming of the future. She began recognizing it. Events that hadn't happened yet felt familiar. Cities she'd never visited gave her the feeling of déjà vu. And the closer she drifted to the outer rim, the colder her thoughts became. Something was pulling her. On a moon outside Nal Hutta, she encountered her first Jedi. She was hiding in the market, watching from behind crates as he negotiated with local mercenaries. A tall man, calm, patient, but she saw something in his future he didn't see himself. He would die in 2 years, not in battle, but by betrayal, struck down by someone he trusted. Someone with a red blade. She wanted to tell him. Part of her still believed that seeing was meant to prevent. But as she stepped forward, she stopped. A wave of silence hit her. Not fear, not uncertainty, something deeper. It wasn't her place. And without a word, she disappeared back into the crowd. That night, she sat alone, thinking about the path of the Jedi, the Guardians, the Keepers of Balance. But all she saw in them was failure. Every vision, every timeline, every war that scarred the galaxy, the Jedi were always at the center of it, trying to preserve peace while holding back a tide they could not understand. They were not the future. They were the obstacle. And it was then, in the quiet space between stars, that she began to change. Her visions stopped being memories. They became weapons, tools. If the Jedi refused to see what was coming, she would use it instead. She began tracing the origins of her dreams, hunting rumors of ancient cults, forgotten temples, lost masters. She followed whispers of dark places, not to fear them, but to find what waited inside. Malachor, Dromund Kaas, Lehon, Ziost, all buried, all forbidden, but all calling to her with the same voice. She was no longer a passive witness, no longer a haunted child. Something had shifted in her. The Force still offered her glimpses of what might be, but now she reached back. She searched. She began asking the Force questions. And the answers were cold. Truth without mercy. The first time she killed, she didn't blink. It was a man who had followed her through 3 systems. A relic hunter, obsessed with ancient Force artifacts. He'd seen her at a ruin on Malachor, watched as she traced the steps of something far older than Jedi or Sith. He didn't know what she was. He only knew he wanted what she could see. He thought she was untrained. He was wrong. He struck first, blade drawn, voice raised, desperate to scare her. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply stepped aside, watched him stumble, and in one precise motion broke his neck with the Force. No anger, no fear, only silence. Afterwards, she sat alone for hours, not in guilt, not in grief, but in understanding. The Force had shown her what to do, and she had obeyed, not out of instinct, but out of purpose. A line had been crossed, and something within her had awakened. She continued moving, deeper into the galaxy's forgotten corridors. Her visions grew sharper, clearer, no longer distant warnings, but maps, pathways. The Force whispered not just what might happen, but what she could make happen. On Ziost, she walked the ruins of an empire that once ruled the stars. Her hand touched stones that pulsed with hatred. Spirits clung to the air, their voices fragmented, broken by time. She stood at the edge of a collapsed temple and wept, not because she was afraid, but because she felt at home. By 13, she had stopped using her birth name. The girl who'd drawn futures in stone was gone. In her place stood something else, patient, silent, always watching. She was no Jedi, no Sith. Not yet. But she had begun to understand what she was becoming. She trained in secret, not with masters, but with memory. She mimicked the combat forms she'd seen in visions, practiced force techniques lost to the archives. She taught herself the language of the Sith, not just their words, but their will, power through knowledge, victory through patience, freedom through fear. She was still years away from her first title, still decades away from the name Cognus, but already her path had narrowed. She was no longer running from her fate, she was walking straight toward it. And somewhere across the stars, two other shadows stirred. Darth Bane, Darth Zannah. She felt them long before they would ever meet. Two points of power locked in conflict, bound by tradition and destined to fall. She did not know their names, but she saw their end. Saw herself standing where one of them would fall. Not as a victim, not as a bystander, as the next. She did not smile when she saw it. She did not cry. She only knelt in the dark, placed her hand against the cold stone of the ruined temple, and whispered a word she did not yet understand. Sith. That night, her dreams burned brighter than ever before. But they were not warnings. Not anymore. They were promises. And somewhere, far beyond the outer rim, on a world scarred by ancient flame, a pair of red eyes turned as if sensing a ripple in the dark. The girl was coming, and the rule of two would never be the same again. She never gave her name, not to her allies, not to her prey, and never to the ones who trained her. To most, she was nothing more than a ghost, a figure that slipped between shadows, one who struck quickly, without warning, and vanished before the body hit the ground. They called her the Huntress, but even that was only a rumor. Some said she had no voice. Others said she was born in the unknown regions, raised in a temple that no longer existed. None of it was true, but none of it mattered, because the truth was colder than myth. She was chosen, taken, and trained in the art of disappearance. No hollow records, no past, no future. Only the present, only the target. Her masters were faceless. They never spoke their names. They lived in the cracks of a galaxy still recovering from the shadows of the Jedi Civil War. On distant worlds forgotten by the Republic. Places like Nar Shaddaa, Onderon, Locke. And in these places, they found the ones who could not be found. Children left behind. Children who didn't cry. She was one of them. Not because she lacked fear, but because fear had stopped working. They gave her nothing but survival. Days without food, nights in complete silence, lessons that started in darkness and ended in pain. They told her nothing except what mattered. Observe, stalk, kill, and always leave no trace. By the time she was 15, she could kill a man twice her size with nothing but a length of wire. She could vanish into a crowd within seconds. And more importantly, she could feel when someone was about to turn around. It wasn't just instinct, it was the Force. But her masters never spoke its name. They feared it. She did not. Because she had known it long before they found her. She had seen too much to be surprised. And in every mission they gave her, every senator marked for death, every Hutt dealer meant to disappear, she obeyed. Without anger, without remorse, because she had already seen their ends. Every face she was sent to kill, she'd dreamed about years before. They were never strangers. They were memories. Somewhere deep inside, she began to realize she wasn't learning anything new. She was simply walking a path that had already been laid out for her. Her visions were growing more specific. She no longer saw only death, she saw herself. Where she would stand, when she would strike, And what she would feel? Nothing, and that frightened her more than the killing. She began to wonder how long she had left before her own face appeared in the dreams, before she saw the moment she herself would die. But those visions never came. Instead, another figure began appearing, a man wrapped in shadow, not faceless, but hidden. He never spoke, but she felt him watching her, as if her choices were being weighed, as if her every move, every breath was being judged by something she could not name. She thought it was another assassin, another master, but it wasn't. It was something else, something deeper, a Sith, and though she did not yet know his name, her path was already moving toward him, not as his equal, not yet, but as the one who would one day kneel and rise again. She was not taught through words. There were no lectures, no scriptures, no codes to recite. Every lesson she learned came through the body, hers or someone else's. When she failed to move quietly, she was struck. When she hesitated, she bled. When she asked questions, they left her in the cold, until she stopped asking. Silence became her teacher. And in that silence, she heard things no one else could. The breathing patterns of a target before they flinched. The low hum of a hidden droid as it tracked her steps. The shift of gravel before a footstep. The hesitation in a heartbeat just before a lie. Her training was not about speed. It was about stillness, stillness of motion, stillness of mind. No emotions, no attachments, only the mission, only the moment. She studied poisons that couldn't be traced, knives that left no wound visible to the naked eye, disguises that allowed her to walk through military checkpoints without drawing a single glance. Her masters sent her across star systems, never with communication, never with backup. Just a name. She never failed. The galaxy knew nothing of her. But powerful people began to fear shadows they couldn't see. A senator dead in his own private shuttle. A warlord whose drink turned black before his lungs collapsed. A Jedi informant found face down in a river with no signs of struggle. And at every scene, nothing left behind. Not even footprints. But she wasn't seeking fame. She wasn't seeking meaning. In truth, she wasn't seeking anything. Because she already knew where she was going. The visions continued, but they had changed. No longer glimpses of scattered death. No longer fractured timelines. Now, she saw structure, sequence. A staircase leading downward. A voice waiting at the end. It wasn't random. It was a calling. And so, even as her masters praised her efficiency, she began disobeying them in secret, not openly, not foolishly, but with purpose. She started delaying missions to follow threads of her dreams. She changed routes to visit locations no contract had ever mentioned. Ruins, tombs, forgotten places. On Dxun, she wandered the jungle for days, following only the pull of her chest. She stood in the shadow of a crashed Mandalorian basilisk, buried in moss. She touched the wreckage and saw a war that hadn't happened yet. A war between Jedi and Sith. Not on battlefields, but in secret. She watched it all unfold in silence, saw the birth of something old, a new Sith order, a new doctrine, based not on armies, but on inheritance. She didn't know it yet, but she was seeing the rule of two. And she was walking straight into its path. Her mind began to shift. She no longer saw her training as survival. She saw it as preparation. Not for more contracts, not for coin, but for something greater, something permanent. She wanted a master, not like the ones who raised her, not cowards who hid behind secrets and shadows, but someone worthy, someone who would break her bones with knowledge, someone who would remake her with purpose. The face in her visions returned. This time, he spoke, no words, only a feeling, recognition. She didn't understand it yet, but she would soon. Her next mission was on Ambria. She was meant to kill a traitor, but her visions showed something else. A duel, a Sith, and a choice that would change the galaxy. She dreamed of the desert before she saw it. Ambria, a world of silence scarred by ancient rituals. The winds carried the whispers of dead sorcerers. The ground itself was poisoned not by toxin but by memory. A place where the Force twisted in on itself. She knew it before she stepped off the ship, and as her boots touched the cracked black soil, the vision returned. Two figures, locked in battle, one cloaked in strength, the other in defiance, lightning splitting the sky, blood on the sand, and in the center of it all, the end of something old. It was not a metaphor. It was real, and it hadn't happened yet. Her contract said nothing of Sith. The assignment was simple: find the traitor hiding in the wastes, eliminate him, return unseen. But she no longer cared about the words her masters sent. The vision was the mission now. She followed the pull. It led her beyond the coordinates, beyond the tracking markers, into a stretch of lifeless rock where nothing should have survived. No cities, no wildlife, no shelter, only dust and wind. And then, the tremor. She didn't hear it. She felt it. The kind of silence that breaks sound. The kind of weight that bends the air around it. It was not a storm. It was something deeper. A presence. She climbed a ridge, looked down into the basin below, and saw them. Two Sith. One, older, massive, wearing armor that seemed fused to his body. The other, younger, sharp-eyed, focused. The battle had already begun. But it wasn't rage, it wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. Each strike a message, each movement a test. Master and apprentice locked in a ritual not meant to be witnessed. But she watched anyway. Not because she wanted to interfere, but because the Force would not let her look away. She saw more than the fight. She saw the history beneath it. The teachings that had led to this moment. The rule of two, stretched to its breaking point. The master, Darth Bane, a survivor of Khan's brotherhood. The apprentice, Darth Zannah, the one meant to inherit his legacy. Only one would survive. And for the first time in her life, the huntress did not know who it would be. That uncertainty shook her. Her visions had always been clear, until now. But something about these two blurred the path ahead. The Force wrapped them in secrecy as if shielding the outcome from even her eyes. The duel grew more violent. The ground scorched. The air cracked. Bane moved with brute power, crashing down like a hammer. Zannah flowed like water, evading, countering, binding. She felt herself, holding her breath. And then it ended. But not with a scream, not with a final blow, with silence. Zannah stood alone. Bane had vanished. She could not tell if he was dead, only that his body was gone. And Zannah did not weep, did not speak. She only turned as if expecting to be watched. Their eyes met. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Zannah lifted her hand. Not in warning, in invitation. The huntress stepped forward, her mission forgotten, her masters irrelevant. The path she thought she'd chosen, revealed as nothing more than a prelude. She had not come to kill. She had come to kneel. The wind burned against her skin as she walked down into the basin. Not from heat, but from something darker. The Force here was scarred, twisted by centuries of pain, ritual, and death. And though her body ached with each step, she didn't stop, because something inside her had already shifted. She was not entering a battlefield. She was entering a threshold. Zannah stood at its center, still, calm, watching her with eyes that did not judge, eyes that had just looked into the soul of a man she once called master, and left him behind. The huntress stopped a few meters away. She didn't speak, neither did Zannah. There were no words left to explain what had happened, only understanding. She had been drawn here not by accident, not by fate, but by design. The rule of two demanded a successor, and Zannah had already chosen, not out of kindness, not out of trust, but because she saw something in the huntress that mirrored her own beginning silence, vision, and purpose. The two stood beneath the darkened sky, surrounded by ash and stone. No witnesses, no ceremony, just an unspoken exchange between predator and shadow. And when the huntress dropped to one knee, the force trembled, not in fear, in recognition. She had never bowed before anyone, not her trainers, not her marks, not even the faces in her visions. But this was different. This was not submission. This was transformation. Zannah stepped forward, her voice soft, but final. There is no peace, there is only passion. The ancient words of the Sith echoed across the wasteland. In your passion, I sense strength. The huntress looked up, and in that moment, her past fell away. She was no longer the girl born beneath Iktoch's storms, no longer the assassin raised in silence. She was something else now, chosen, claimed, reforged. Not yet a Darth, but no longer a tool. Zannah turned away, began walking into the distance, toward whatever came next. The huntress followed. No questions, no fear, only the whisper of the Force, and the growing shadow beneath her steps. That night, they didn't speak again. They found shelter in an ancient ruin, carved into the bones of the earth, a place once used for forgotten rituals. The walls still hummed with residual power. Zannah meditated. The huntress remained still, listening, observing. But inside her, the visions returned more vivid than ever. She saw Zannah's face again, older, worn, angry. She saw herself, cloaked in darkness, standing over a broken figure in chains. And in the final vision, she saw her own eyes reflected in the eyes of a child, filled with fear. She didn't understand it, not yet, but she felt its weight, not as prophecy, but as warning. The path of the Sith had no safety, no destiny, only survival. And already, the training had begun, not with orders, but with presence. Zannah would not guide her gently. She would break her, strip her of identity, push her into madness and back. But the huntress would endure, because she had already lived without mercy, already killed without anger. And now, she would learn to rule without regret. The darkness on Ambria did not lift. Even after the duel ended, even after the sand settled, the air remained heavy, as if the ground itself refused to release the memory of what had happened. She had watched it all, not as a Sith, not yet, but as something worse, a witness, to the death of a legend, to the breaking of a lineage that had endured through centuries of war, betrayal, and silence, to the fall of Darth Bane. But it had not ended the way she expected. The man who had survived the thought bomb, who had founded the rule of two with fire and cruelty, had fallen, not in rage, but in confusion. His will had not broken, but his body had, crushed beneath the weight of his own legacy. Zannah had stood over him, blood on her lips, hands trembling from the ritual she had dared to unleash. Sith sorcery, ancient, forbidden, and intimate. The kind of power that steals the soul, not the body. The girl, the huntress, had felt it all through the Force. The clash of ideologies, the duel beneath the surface. Not saber against saber, but will against will. And in that final second, something had changed. Zannah had won, but the victory felt incomplete. Not hollow, not weak, but unfinished, as though part of Bane still lingered not in body, not in voice, but in shadow. No one could say for certain who survived, not even her, but Zannah rose, and Bane did not. That was all that mattered. And in that quiet, the rule of two continued. For a long time, neither Zannah nor the huntress spoke. They stood in the black sand, surrounded by the scars of the battle. The Force still trembled around them, echoing with what had been done. It was not just a battle between master and apprentice. It was a ritual of transfer, a rite. The most sacred moment in the Sith line where power passed from one to the next, not through inheritance, but through death. And now it was over. The huntress waited. She did not approach, did not kneel, not yet, because she needed to understand what she had seen. Was Bane truly gone? Had Zannah become more than just a killer? Had the rule endured, or had it fractured? Zannah finally turned, her robes tattered, her eyes darker than they had ever been. But there was something cold in her gaze, not evil, not madness, certainty. She looked at the huntress not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a mirror. And that's when the huntress understood. This had never been Bane's story. Not truly. His rule had ended the moment he chose Zannah. The moment he allowed the seed of doubt to grow. The moment he believed the Sith needed to change, but could not bring himself to let go. Zannah had let go. She had done what every apprentice must do. And now, she needed another. The silence between them stretched. But it was not empty. It was filled with unspoken knowledge, pain, memory, legacy, and the Force waited. Because the rule of two was not a doctrine. It was a wound, one that could only stay open through blood. And somewhere, deep inside the huntress, something old broke apart. The last piece of what she had been. The final breath of hesitation. She was no longer hunting. She was being called. She followed Zannah into the ruins, not out of fear, not out of duty, but because something inside her had already accepted what was coming. The temple was ancient, older than either of them could measure. Built by Sith long before Bane, long before the Republic had ever feared the dark. The walls were cracked, the carvings faded. But the energy that lingered was sharp, like rusted blades, pressed against the skin of the Force. Zannah moved slowly, not weakened, but calm. Her steps made no sound, her presence fully her own. And yet, not alone. The huntress felt it again. That flicker, that pressure, like something watching from behind Zannah's eyes. Not Bane's voice, not his spirit, but the idea of him refusing to fade, refusing to be erased. She had expected death to be simple, final. But this wasn't death. This was inheritance. They came to a chamber beneath the ground. No light reached it. The air was stale with memory, and there, in the center, Zannah stopped. She turned. At last, she spoke. He thought he could live forever. The huntress said nothing. Zannah raised her hand, staring at her own fingers, as if feeling them for the first time. He tried to take me, to push his essence into mine, but he failed. Still, she didn't sound victorious. Just tired. The huntress stepped forward. She could feel it now, the scars in the Force, where two minds had collided, where control had been wrestled, not granted. "What remains of him?" she asked. Zannah's answer was quiet. "Only what I allow." The huntress believed her, but she also saw the truth beneath the words. Zannah had survived, but survival had a cost. Part of her had been burned away in the process. Part of her mind now echoed with the thoughts of another. Bane was gone, but not forgotten, and perhaps not entirely silent. Zannah looked at her, truly looked. "You've seen this, haven't you?" The huntress nodded. "Not the details, only the feeling, the moment." Zannah studied her carefully. Her voice dropped lower. "Then you know why you're here." The Force curled between them, as if holding its breath. "I need an apprentice." The huntress didn't react, not outwardly, but inside, something shifted. Not joy, not pride. Purpose. Zannah continued. "You are powerful, more than you know. You see things others fear. You don't run from the dark. You understand it." She stepped closer. "But you are still unshaped. You've learned how to kill, but not why." The huntress met her gaze. "Then teach me." Zannah was silent for a long moment, as if testing the weight of that request, as if listening for something beneath the words. Then, finally, she nodded. "I will." She turned away. "But only if you're ready to be broken." The huntress did not flinch. "I already have been." The answer hung in the air, and the rule of two shifted forward, from master and ghost to master and blade. Zannah left the chamber without looking back. The huntress followed, two Sith no longer alone, the one who had endured, and the one who would one day end her. The storm passed, but Ambria remained still. The planet did not celebrate the end of a Sith duel. It did not mourn the death of a master. It simply endured, just as it had through the rituals of the dark sorcerers, just as it had through Bane's experiments, and now, through the rise of something new. In the days that followed, the huntress remained close to Zannah, not as an equal, not as a friend, but as a shadow, watching, listening, waiting to be forged. Zannah did not speak often. Her words were measured, her instructions sparse, but everything she did was deliberate. Every gesture had weight. She was not nurturing. She was not cruel. She was precise. They returned to the surface after 3 days beneath the ground. The wind had softened, but the scars remained in the sand, in the stone, in the Force. Zannah stood at the site of Bane's final breath. Her hand hovered over the spot where he fell. She did not cry. She did not mark the ground. But her silence spoke. The huntress understood. This was not a place of memory. It was a grave. And in the rule of two, graves were not visited. They were stepped over. Because legacy did not live in tombs. It lived in successors. That night, the stars above Ambria shone faintly through the clouds. And for the first time, the huntress sat in stillness, not as prey, not as a killer, but as something in between. She could feel the Force differently now. It no longer brushed past her like wind. It pressed inward. It listened. And when she closed her eyes, she saw not visions, but choices. She did not know when it had changed. Perhaps during the duel, perhaps the moment she knelt. But her connection had deepened. It no longer showed her what would happen. It waited to respond to what she would do. Zannah approached her quietly. "Tell me what you saw," she said. The huntress didn't hesitate. "I saw 2 shadows, one full of rage, one full of control, both convinced they would win." Zannah nodded. "And which one survived?" The huntress looked at her carefully. The one who let go. Zannah said nothing more, but for the first time, the edge in her expression softened. Not approval, not kindness, just a flicker of understanding. That was enough. Days passed. The transition was not sudden. There was no ceremony, no new name given. But everything between them had changed. The huntress obeyed now, not out of fear, but out of conviction. And Zannah demanded much. She stripped away comforts, took her to the edge of exhaustion, broke her thoughts with questions that had no answer. What is strength? What is fear? What are you willing to lose? Each day, the huntress returned with new answers. Each night, Zannah broke them apart, not to shame her, but to teach her how to rebuild. Because the Sith were not just assassins, they were architects of history, of power, of endings, and the girl who once dreamed in fire was no longer a watcher of fate. She was its tool. Soon, she would be its master. She knelt again, not in ceremony, not for approval. This time, it was different. They stood at the edge of a forgotten cliff, high above the wastes of Ambria. The wind was sharp, the stars above, distant and cold. Below them, the dark lake shimmered, still poisoned, still quiet. It had seen more Sith than most worlds in the galaxy, more ghosts than graves, and now it would see the rise of another. Zannah spoke with her back turned. There is no safety in the rule of two. The huntress said nothing. Zannah continued. You will not be protected. You will not be loved. You will not be remembered. She turned slowly. But you will be feared. The huntress met her gaze. I am ready. Zannah walked forward. For a moment, she simply studied her, the scars that had not yet healed, the hunger that had not yet cooled, the eyes that had not yet forgotten who she used to be. You've had many names, she said, but they were not yours. The huntress didn't blink. Then give me one that is. Zannah lowered her hand. The force curled between them. From that moment forward, the huntress was gone. She would be remembered by only one name. Darth Cognus. There was no thunder, no windshift, no power unleashed. Just the quiet passing of a title that had destroyed worlds, and would again. Zannah stepped back. There will come a time when you will betray me, when you will try to end me. That is the rule. Cognus nodded. I know. Zannah's voice dropped to a whisper. When that time comes, do not hesitate. Cognus stared out into the black horizon. I won't. And in that final silence, something ancient continued. The rule of two, once forged by Bane, now carried by Zannah, lived on through Cognus. Not because it was perfect, not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. A truth too dangerous to survive through peace. A weapon too powerful to be trusted with many. Only two. Always two. And now, the chain remained unbroken. Cognus would no longer see the future in broken visions. She would shape it with her own hands. With patience, with silence, with fear. She had been many things. A seer, a child, a weapon. But now, she was a Sith. And somewhere deep in the stars, another force sensitive was being born. Another apprentice, unaware of the darkness waiting for them. The future would not wait, but Cognus would, because that was her strength. She did not need to conquer to prove herself. She only needed time. Time to learn, time to watch, time to strike. And when the moment came, there would be no mercy, only legacy. Names have power. The Jedi believe a name marks identity, a light to be known. The Sith believe otherwise. A name is a weapon, a mask, a promise spoken only in silence. She was named in the dark, not in a grand temple, not before a council, but in a ruin beneath the surface of Ambria, where the stones still whispered the death of Bane, where Zannah stood tall in robes scorched by sorcery, and the woman who had once been the huntress knelt without fear. Zannah looked down at her. "You have no name now," she said. "Only the one I give." And the force shifted like it recognized the ritual, the weight of legacy hanging between them. Zannah's voice cut through the dark. "You are Darth Cognus." There was no celebration, no rush of energy, only silence. And in that stillness, Cognus breathed in the name, not like a title, like a scar. She didn't speak it aloud. She didn't need to. It was already written into her soul. Cognus rose to her feet. Her posture changed, her presence sharpened. She moved like someone who had no past left to hide. The huntress was dead, and in her place stood the next shadow of the Sith, cold, quiet, watching. Zannah didn't smile. Sith masters didn't smile. But something in her expression shifted, a flicker of acceptance, not approval, just clarity. She turned and walked deeper into the ruin. Cognus followed without being told. The training had already begun. The rule of two demanded more than obedience. It demanded transformation. Cognus knew this. She had studied her own visions long enough to understand what came next. This would not be like the lessons of her old masters. There would be no tasks for reward, no drills for survival. Zannah was not building a soldier. She was crafting a rival. And Cognus was already preparing to become one. The days that followed were brutal in silence. Zannah gave no schedule, no structure. Every morning began in stillness. Every evening ended in exhaustion. Cognus was not taught what to do. She was left to fail until understanding struck, whether it came in hours or weeks. In the dark, she meditated beside her master, surrounded by tombs that had never been opened. She reached for the Force not with desperation, but with patience, waiting for it to reveal itself, letting it guide her, not control her. And at night, she dreamed again. But the visions had changed. No longer scattered fragments of fate, no longer shadows of strangers. Now, she saw herself not just walking the path, but shaping it. She stood in the robes of a master. Faceless apprentices knelt before her. Temples fell in the distance. Jedi screamed her name. And always, always, the darkness behind her whispered, "Not yet." It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. She was not finished. Zannah watched all of this unfold without comment. She never asked about the dreams. She never spoke of the future. Because she already knew if Cognus was worthy, she would survive. If not, she would die without needing to be struck down. That was how the Sith preserved themselves. Not through mercy, but through waiting. And Cognus would wait. Not because she feared her master, but because she was learning how to become one. Cognus had known many teachers, but none like Zannah. There was no rhythm to her instruction, no consistency. Days passed in silence, then suddenly pain, a ritual, a trial, a lesson whispered at midnight, then never spoken again. It was not a method designed to inform. It was meant to break. But Cognus did not resist. She absorbed everything, not just the Force techniques, not just the histories carved into forgotten walls. She studied Zannah herself, the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she concealed her emotions beneath layers of restraint. Zannah was not like Bane. She did not command. She did not threaten. She watched, and her silence was sharper than a blade. Cognus came to understand that she was not only being tested in ability, but in awareness. Zannah wanted a successor who saw everything not just in the Force, but in people. And so, Cognus listened more than she spoke. She observed the tone of Zannah's voice when she recited Sith teachings, the flicker in her expression when Bane's name came up, the tension in her fingers when she touched the hilts of both sabers. She was still haunted. She still carried pieces of him inside her. Cognus didn't press. She didn't need to. Her role wasn't to confront, it was to learn. And what she learned was power hidden in discipline. Zannah was a master of the mind. She didn't overpower. She infiltrated. Her knowledge of Sith sorcery went beyond rituals. She could peel thoughts apart, implant fear, twist memories. She didn't attack her enemies with brute strength. She let them destroy themselves. Cognus studied these methods in silence, but she also began to see something else, something subtle. A slow shift. Zannah's power remained intact, but her edge was softening. She no longer woke at first light. Her meditations lasted longer. Her instructions came slower, not out of carelessness, but out of fatigue. Years of holding the rule alone were beginning to weigh on her. And Cognus took note. Not with pride, not with cruelty, but with certainty. Time moved forward, and so did succession. Zannah began assigning her more advanced tasks. Not just combat but influence. Cognus was sent into syndicates, tasked with manipulating leaders. She posed as diplomats, mercenaries, spies, and each time she returned with more than victory. She returned with knowledge. Knowledge of fear, of how easily sentience surrendered to illusion, of how fragile the mind became when it doubted its own reality. Zannah was pleased, but she did not praise. Instead, she offered new challenges, a test of loyalty, a secret to guard, a ritual to complete without guidance. And Cognus met each one in silence, because her strength was not in fire, it was in waiting. At night, she stood beneath the stars of forgotten worlds, staring upward not with longing, but with calculation. She imagined the future, not in dreams, but in steps. One day, she would rise. But not today. Today, she remained beneath the eyes of her master. Not to worship her, not to challenge her, to understand her. Because the rule of two was not about succession alone. It was about readiness. And when the moment came, the real moment, it would not be chosen by rage, or grief, or pride. It would be chosen by silence. The Sith did not believe in obedience for its own sake. They believed in obedience with purpose. Submission that sharpened the blade, not dulled it. A Sith obeyed only to one day surpass. Cognus understood this. She lived it. Every command Zannah gave her was followed without hesitation, but not blindly. She obeyed as one memorizes a map, not to remain where she is, but to see the path forward more clearly. Zannah was a master of ritual. Not the kind practiced in temples, the kind buried in the bones of ancient Sith. Cognus learned them not from lectures, but from participation. Forced to channel the Force through symbols carved in blood. Made to speak words in forgotten tongues until her voice failed. Left alone in chambers, where spirits whispered things that should not be heard. The rituals were not just ceremonies, they were revelations. One rite demanded she remain awake for 5 days, immersed in a trance of Sith incantations. If her focus wavered, the spirits within would tear at her sanity. On the 3rd night, her visions broke into pieces. Faces of past Sith appeared, some she recognized, some she didn't. But they all said the same thing. You are not ready. She did not break. On the 5th morning, when Zannah returned, Cognus was still kneeling. Her body trembled, her voice gone, but her will untouched. Zannah said nothing. She didn't need to. Another time, Zannah taught her the art of memory tampering. Cognus was instructed to infiltrate a governor's estate and convince him he had sentenced his own family to death. Through fear, through suggestion, through the Force, no blades, no poison, just influence. The governor collapsed into despair within 3 days. Cognus never stepped inside his home. When she returned, Zannah gave her the final line of the Sith code. There is only power. Cognus repeated it, but not aloud. She repeated it inwardly, quietly, because her strength was not in declaration. It was in control. The final ritual she endured was never explained. Zannah simply led her to a structure half buried on a moon near Relg. The interior was cold, the walls covered in carvings older than the Jedi Order. Cognus was told to enter alone, and to leave only when she understood. She remained inside for 7 days. The force inside the ruin was not violent. It was hollow, like the memory of something terrible that no longer had a name. She wandered its corridors, sat in its center, listened to the silence. At first, she waited for a vision, then for a voice. Neither came, only stillness. On the 6th night, she understood. This place had no lesson, only patience, only power beneath stillness. She stood in the dark and spoke her name aloud. Not the name she was given, the one she chose, Cognus. And the walls did not answer. But they did not reject her. She stepped out on the 7th morning. Zannah was waiting. Did you see what you needed? Cognus looked her in the eye. I saw enough. Zannah nodded. And for the first time in years, she stepped aside. She didn't strike. Not that year, not the next, not even after the rituals ended. Cognus waited, because she understood what Zannah had taught her, not through words, but through survival. The rule of 2 was not built on passion alone. It was built on timing, on clarity, on the quiet strength of watching long enough to see where the cracks would form. And Zannah had cracks. Not in power, not in command, but in rhythm. She no longer trained daily. She no longer searched the galaxy for ancient texts. Her vision had turned inward, her questions more reflective than instructive. She spoke of legacy, not of conquest, of preservation, not progress. Cognus heard these shifts and filed them away. She didn't question Zannah's power. Not yet. Her master was still strong, still dangerous, still fully capable of ripping her mind apart with a glance. But strength wasn't the only metric. Will mattered more, and Zannah's will was tired. Cognus trained in secret, not to hide, but to prepare. She practiced her mental defenses, not just against assault but against deception. She meditated in complete darkness for days, forcing herself to separate the voice of the Force from the voice of fear. She read everything Zannah gave her, then studied what Zannah refused to share. And she watched. Every pause, every hesitation, every moment her master repeated a ritual slightly slower than the year before. This was not betrayal. This was duty, because the apprentice who does not watch for weakness is not a Sith. She is a servant, and Cognus had never been that. She had once hunted men across the stars, watched them from shadows until they exposed themselves. She had learned patience not from the Sith, but from silence. Now, she applied it to her master. But still, she waited, not out of mercy, out of certainty, because a premature challenge would be death. And she didn't want to destroy Zannah in anger. She wanted to bury her in truth, the truth that her time had ended. That was the Sith way. In the solitude of abandoned systems, Cognus sharpened her skills. She mastered illusions. Not flashy tricks, subtle manipulations of memory. She could rewrite a day in someone's mind with a whisper. Could implant fear so deep it would take months to surface. She practiced not only to be powerful, but to be undetectable. One day, Zannah would sense the threat, but not yet, because Cognus still needed more. More understanding, more time, more mastery of the shadows that waited just beyond reach. And the galaxy gave it to her. The Jedi had turned inward, the Sith remained hidden. The Republic grew bloated and slow. In this calm before another storm, Cognus watched as the future twisted like smoke. She saw possibilities in the Force, not visions, not prophecies, just patterns, fractures, weakness. And somewhere in those patterns, she saw her own rise. But she did not celebrate. Because the Sith do not celebrate. They wait. And when the time is right, they end what must be ended. Not for revenge, but for continuity. She still called Zannah her master, still obeyed, still learned. But every lesson now had two purposes: to serve and to surpass. Because the rule of two had not survived through dominance. It had survived through patience. And Darth Cognus was its future. Cognus never heard Zannah scream. Not once. Not in pain, not in fury. Not even when her rituals demanded blood or her body gave out during hours of unbroken trance. Zannah did not scream, but her silence carried weight. And Cognus had learned to listen. The teachings continued. Lessons passed not with pride but with pressure. Zannah had become more exacting, her expectations higher. Her punishments quieter. She corrected with a glance, directed with a word. And when Cognus succeeded, there was no praise. Only another test. But the tension was growing. Not in their bond, in Zannah herself. It was subtle at first. Her voice, slower. Her commands, more measured. At times, she stared too long into the firelight of their encampments, her fingers moving as if reciting spells no longer needed. She meditated deeper, for longer. Sometimes, when Cognus spoke to her, she did not answer. Not because she didn't hear, because she was remembering something else. It was the past. And Cognus knew what that meant. Zannah had defeated Bane in body, but she had never erased him from her mind. His teachings, his warnings, his doubt, it still lived in her. And with each passing year, the weight of legacy bent her posture lower. Cognus observed this with precision. She asked nothing, she accused no one. But in the dark corners of her own thoughts, she began to record the details. Zannah's hesitation, Zannah's nostalgia, Zannah's fear. It wasn't the fear of death. It was worse. The fear of failure. Zannah had preserved the rule. She had trained an apprentice, but she had never surpassed Bane's legend. Not truly. She had built nothing, destroyed no order. She had hidden, endured, waited, and now the waiting turned inward. Cognus knew it would be her task to end it. But not yet, because the rule of two did not reward haste. It punished it. So Cognus became quieter, more obedient, more exact. She answered every question before it was asked, finished every assignment without flaw, and in doing so, she gave Zannah no reason to doubt her. Because that, too, was the Sith way. To serve perfectly, until the moment you don't. She also began collecting knowledge. Not just Sith lore but patterns, weaknesses. She noted which words unsettled Zannah, which names caused her eyes to narrow. She studied Bane's holocron in secret, memorizing not just the words but the inflections of power within them. Zannah taught her how to use fear as a weapon, but Cognus was learning how to use memory. Because the Force remembers, and sometimes so do its victims. In one rare moment of honesty, Zannah spoke of Korriban. They were camped beneath the ruins of an ancient tomb, the twin moons hanging low in the sky. Cognus asked why Zannah had never returned to claim it. Zannah replied with a whisper, "There are some places, the rule does not follow you." She did not explain. She didn't have to. Cognus watched her walk into the night, and for the first time she saw not a master, but a prisoner, not of Bane, of legacy. And she understood what must come next. Zannah would not fall in battle. She would fall when her secrets stopped protecting her. And Cognus was already becoming the one secret she would never see coming. Cognus began to notice it more clearly, once she knew what to look for. The cracks were not loud. They didn't reveal themselves in failure or sudden weakness. They appeared in the quiet moments, the small spaces between Zannah's words, the pauses in her breath, the tightening of her jaw when she thought no one was watching. Zannah was aging, not in body. Her strength remained sharp, her mastery of sorcery untouched, but her mind carried too much history, too much weight. The rule of two demanded constant readiness, but Zannah's readiness had shifted into reflection. And reflection, for a Sith, was a slow kind of death. Cognus tested the boundaries of this change without being seen. She arrived late to a meditation cycle, watching carefully to see if Zannah would react. The master opened her eyes, but instead of anger, there was only tired acknowledgement. A small thing, but small things matter to the Sith. On another day, Zannah repeated a lesson she had taught months before, unaware she was repeating herself. Cognus answered as though hearing it for the first time. She wanted to know how deep the repetition went, how far the memory frayed. Zannah didn't seem to notice, but Cognus did. She also noticed something more dangerous, Zannah's increasing reliance on rituals. Tasks that once required only a gesture now demanded full incantations. She meditated longer to maintain clarity. Sometimes an entire day passed before she spoke a single word. Cognus knew better than to ask if she was well. Sith don't heal with concern. They heal by enduring. But endurance has limits. One night, as the twin stars of a distant system fell below the horizon, Zannah tried to summon a memory projection. It was a technique she had mastered long ago, one that once came as easily as breath. But this time, the illusion flickered, warped, collapsed into darkness before it could form a single image. Zannah stared into the void where the memory should have been. And Cognus saw something she was not meant to see. Doubt. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was real. And once Cognus saw it, she could not unsee it. Masters were not supposed to doubt. Not themselves, not the future, not the rule. Zannah had always carried herself as if everything was part of her design, but the cracks were showing. Not because of weakness, but because she had borne the weight of survival alone for too long. Bane had built the rule of two on ambition. Zannah had maintained it through discipline. But Cognus would continue it through clarity. And clarity demanded truth. The truth was simple. Zannah was no longer the Sith she once was. Not broken, but dimming. A candle burning low, its flame still fierce but unsteady. Cognus did not rush to exploit it. She did not celebrate. She did not let impatience cloud her judgment. Instead, she studied Zannah more deeply. She listened to her tone, measured her movements, memorized the pace of her thoughts. Every detail mattered. Every shift mattered. Because one day, she would have to strike. One day, she would have to decide the moment. And if she chose too early, she would die. If she chose too late, the rule would die with her. That was the burden of the apprentice. Not to love the master, not to hate them, but to watch them fade, and to end them before the galaxy noticed. Cognus knew the time was approaching. Not now, not soon, but approaching, like a shadow walking quietly behind her. She kept her voice soft when she spoke to Zannah now. She moved slowly. She hid her strength. She hid her certainty. Because betrayal does not begin with a blade. It begins with observation. And Cognus observed everything. The Sith do not keep journals. They leave no memoirs, no final testaments. No sacred texts meant to be passed down without alteration. Knowledge is survival. Secrets are power. And memory is a weapon. Zannah had memories that no one else carried. Not just of Bane's death, but of everything before it. The Sith who came before the rule. The brotherhood that had failed. The wars that consumed both Jedi and Sith alike. She carried those moments like scars carved behind her eyes. And sometimes, when the firelight flickered low and her voice drifted into quiet monologue, those memories slipped out. Not stories, warnings. Cognus listened without reacting. But she never forgot a word. They weren't weak, Zannah once said. They were too many, too loud. They believed they were unstoppable, and so they stopped listening. Cognus understood. That was what Bane had feared, what he tried to destroy. A Sith order that had grown fat on pride, spreading like wildfire, consuming itself. Zannah had survived the cleansing, but she had never stopped carrying the ashes. Cognus learned more from those silences than from any direct teaching. She learned what haunted Zannah, what she regretted, what she hid behind her command of fear. Because even fear grows tired. One night, during a mission to an ancient Sith archive on Prakith, they found a sealed chamber untouched for centuries. Inside, the walls were lined with inscriptions too faded to fully read. But Zannah seemed to recognize the shape of them. She ran her hand along the stone, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then softly, she whispered a name. Balia Darzu. Cognus recognized it. A Sith Lady of the Old Order, known for her use of Mechuderu, the ability to manipulate machines with the Force. But that wasn't why Zannah remembered her. She trusted no one, Zannah said. She built armies of metal because she didn't believe an apprentice would ever be loyal. Cognus said nothing. Zannah's voice grew quieter. She was right. They left the archive without another word. But the memory remained. Zannah was thinking of her own apprentice now. Of Cognus, of the chain they were both a part of. And for the first time, Cognus felt her master looking through her, not at her. A long stare, a quiet test. Cognus passed it by not reacting. Because when the master begins to doubt, the apprentice must not flinch. But the moment stayed with her. Zannah had looked into her and seen not a servant, not a blade, but a reflection. And Cognus knew the truth. Zannah was remembering Bane. The way he had looked at her, the way he had tested her, the way, in his final moment, he had hesitated just enough to be defeated. It was all happening again. Not in vision, in memory. The rule of two was not a straight line. It was a circle, and Zannah had become the thing she once destroyed. Cognus could feel it in her own thoughts now. A strange echo, not prophecy, not certainty. A memory, waiting to happen again. and she knew her task. To break the circle, not in rage, but in clarity. The same clarity Zannah once had. The same clarity Bane had lost. Because the memory of the Sith doesn't live in holocrons. It lives in blood. And blood must be spilled before it forgets who it serves. She didn't plan it all at once. There was no grand scheme, no intricate betrayal unfolding across systems and cycles. Cognus prepared like she breathed steadily, silently, without recognition. Because Sith don't wait to act. They wait to be certain. Zannah had taught her that, not directly, but through every delay, every test, every moment withheld until the Force whispered that the time was right. And now, it was Cognus who listened. She began closing doors behind her, quietly shifting responsibilities, cutting off unnecessary allies, redirecting credits, burying knowledge. She made herself smaller in Zannah's presence, while making her influence larger everywhere else. She reinforced her mental defenses to resist Zannah's sorcery. Not with brute will, but with misdirection. She practiced appearing weaker than she was, making her thoughts feel scattered, tired, devoted. She didn't want Zannah to see strength. She wanted her to see loyalty. Because the final lie of every apprentice is that they still serve. And Cognus was ready to lie. She did not know the exact day it would come, only that it would. Because Zannah had begun asking questions that no longer belonged to a master. Do you believe the Jedi will rise again? Do you think the rule will outlast us? Would you change it if you could? Cognus answered each question with careful silence, letting Zannah believe she was still a student, still shaped by her shadow, still believing that legacy was enough. But Cognus did not believe in legacy. She believed in motion, and the Sith only move forward by sacrifice. When the time came, it would not be ceremonial. There would be no witness, no record, just the cold edge of inevitability. But the killing was not the hard part. It never was. The preparation was. Knowing where to strike, how to strike, when to strike, and most of all, how to carry the rule afterward, without becoming what she destroyed. That was the burden, not the duel, the continuation. Because once Zannah fell, everything would rest on her shoulders. The entire future of the Sith, the entire structure of survival, the line of power reduced to one breath, her own. And if she failed, it would all collapse. Cognus knew this, accepted it, trained for it. She began exploring the stars alone more often, seeking lost teachings, tracing the remains of old Sith fortresses, not for their weapons, but for their warnings. She read about failure, about Sith who had claimed the name but not the discipline, lords who had destroyed their masters, only to fall to madness, acolytes who had sought power too quickly, and left the galaxy scattered in their wake. She studied them not to mimic them, but to never become them. Because the Sith don't survive through power alone, they survive through vision. Zannah had carried Bane's vision long enough, but her eyes no longer saw the future. They looked back. Cognus saw forward, and in her vision, there was always one image. Her hand, her blade, Zannah kneeling not in defeat but in exhaustion, ready to be replaced. There would be no gloating, no fury, only the final lie, that she had never planned this, that she still loved her master, that she still served. And when that lie passed between them, she would strike. Not because she hated Zannah, but because she honored her. And the rule demands only one truth. The strongest must remain. It did not begin with an argument. There was no betrayal shouted across stone walls, no lightsabers drawn in defiance, no ancient temple cracked in half by unleashed rage. It began with stillness. Cognus entered the chamber as she always had, kneeling without instruction, waiting without sound, her face expressionless, her presence folded inward like a blade turned flat against the wind. Zannah sat in meditation, the same position, the same breath, the same silence that had ruled their dynamic for years. But something had changed. Cognus felt it the moment she stepped through the threshold, a tension, not in the air, but in Zannah herself. Her body was still, but the force around her had begun to slip. Not wild, not fractured, just tired, like a thread pulled too long across too many years. She did not speak. Cognus waited. Minutes passed. Then Zannah opened her eyes, and Cognus knew it was time. Because Zannah did not speak with command. She did not ask a question or issue a task. She simply looked at her, with understanding. A master who had nothing left to teach. Zannah nodded once, and that was the invitation. The Sith do not ask to be challenged. They wait until the apprentice dares. Cognus rose without a sound. No anger in her step, no fear in her bones, only clarity. The same clarity she had carried since the moment her visions first led her to Ambria. Since the moment she realized what the rule of two demanded. Zannah stood slowly. Her saber did not ignite. Not yet. They moved in a circle around each other, a ritual older than either of them. Passed down in whispers, never recorded. This was not a duel of revenge. This was not justice. This was necessity. The rule had to continue. Zannah spoke first, her voice steady. You've waited a long time. Cognus met her gaze. You taught me how. Another pause. Zannah nodded, and then the sabers came alive. No scream, no fury. Just red light humming through ancient air. They struck once. Blades collided, and the force rippled like breath, drawn too sharply. Zannah's style was elegant, efficient, rooted in the sorcery of the mind. She reached out not just with her saber, but with illusions, probing Cognus's thoughts, pressing into her memories, trying to disorient her. But Cognus had spent years building walls inside her own mind, not to keep Zannah out, to reflect her back. The illusions twisted, failed, dissolved into static. Zannah adjusted. They circled again. Cognus struck low. Zannah countered. Sparks snapped against stone. Every motion was measured. Neither wasted energy. Neither gave ground. They weren't fighting to destroy each other. They were fighting to reveal the truth. Who was stronger? Who was ready? Who had already won? Before the blades even touched. And deep down, Zannah knew. It wasn't her. Not anymore. But she didn't surrender. Because Sith don't die willingly. They are taken. And that was what Cognus had come to do. She struck again, not for the kill, but for the shift. Her blade locked Zannah's. Their eyes met. And in that final exchange, there was no hate. Only recognition. Zannah saw herself as she had once seen Bane, and Cognus saw her future, written in the reflection of her master's eyes. A future with no more lessons to receive, only ones to give. The sabers clashed once more, and the line ended. Zannah didn't fall like Bane did. There was no broken body left crumpled in the dust. No final cry of resistance. No words etched into the force to echo after death. She simply stopped. One moment she was standing saber raised, breath sharp, eyes locked in defiance. The next, her weapon slipped from her hand, and the air turned still. Cognus stood across from her, saber humming low, unmoved. She hadn't struck a fatal blow, not in the way others would expect. There was no violence etched into the stone, no burn marks of desperate power, just a single moment where the apprentices will eclipse the masters. And Zannah understood. She stepped back and knelt, her breathing shallow, her voice low. "It's yours now." Cognus lowered her weapon. Zannah looked up at her, not with sorrow, but with peace. "You were patient." Cognus didn't respond. Zannah nodded faintly. "And I was tired." There were no more commands, no more trials, no more titles left to pass. Zannah closed her eyes, and the silence around them deepened. The Force seemed to bow not in grief, but in acknowledgement, as if it, too, recognized the closing of a chapter too long in the writing. Cognus stepped forward. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply extended her hand. Zannah took it, not for help, for acceptance. They remained like that for a moment, master and apprentice, bound not by loyalty but by purpose. And then Zannah collapsed, her weight light, her breath gone. Cognus caught her, held her, lowered her to the floor. No one witnessed it. No monument would be built. No holocron would sing of this moment. But it happened all the same. The end of a Sith, and the birth of one more. Cognus stood alone now, not in mourning, but in recognition. The rule of two did not allow for sentiment, but that didn't mean it lacked meaning. Zannah had survived Bane, had preserved the Order, had trained her successor without failure. That was legacy enough. Cognus looked down one final time. Zannah's expression was calm, almost grateful, as if death had come not as punishment, but as permission. The silence said everything. There were no echoes left to haunt the space. Only the stillness of truth. Cognus ignited her saber once more. A single motion, a clean end. No suffering, no hesitation. Zannah's body burned where it lay, consumed by red light and rising ash. The Force trembled once, and then grew quiet. There would be no tomb, no grave, only memory. And that, Cognus understood, was the truest fate of the Sith, not to be remembered, but to be replaced. She stood as the ashes cooled, not as a student, not as a killer, but as what came next. She did not say Zannah's name again, because it was no longer hers to speak. The line had ended, and from that silence, a new one had begun. The Sith don't mourn, they inherit, and in the quiet that followed Zannah's death, Cognus did not grieve. She collected no relics, spoke no final words, made no record of the passing. Instead, she turned inward toward the inheritance that could not be touched. The knowledge, the burden, the right to continue. For years, Zannah had shaped her in silence, testing her patience, honing her will, withholding affection, praise, even trust, not to punish, but to prepare. And now Cognus understood. Every moment had been a mirror of this one. To stand alone, and not collapse. She left the chamber without looking back, left Zannah's remains to drift into the dust, to disappear like all Sith before her. The rule of two had no grave markers, no legacy but the next, and she was it. The last apprentice, now the only master. The galaxy did not change. No tremor shook the stars. No Jedi sensed the shift, but the dark side did. It whispered differently now, no longer coiled around her teacher. It curved around her steps, waited for her breath, offered choices instead of chains. It had accepted her. Cognus did not feel larger, or more powerful. She felt centered, like a door had closed behind her, and in front of her stood nothing but the future, unwritten, unshaped, and dangerous. She walked for hours, not to reflect, but to think. What would come next? The rule of two did not teach ambition without vision. It did not reward simple conquest. It demanded clarity. The Sith survived not through power alone, but through timing. And the galaxy was not yet ready for what she would become. So she would wait. But not in silence. She began assembling what Zannah never had: structure. She built caches across uninhabited systems, data vaults filled with ancient scripts and Sith alchemy. She returned to Korriban not to claim it, but to understand what it had become. A myth, a warning, a test. And it failed all three. The past could not guide the Sith forward anymore. Its ghosts were too loud. Its stories too swollen. Cognus saw through it all. She was not here to resurrect dead empires. She was here to choose the right heir. And that meant watching again. For years, perhaps. But time was her weapon. She was born to wait. Zannah had endured. Cognus would design. And one day, the next apprentice would come not as a tool of wrath, but as a thread in a design they could not see. She would test them not with cruelty, but with the architecture of fear. She would offer them nothing, so they could find everything. Because that was the inheritance, not just power, but inevitability. The Sith could not be stopped. Not by Jedi, not by armies, because as long as one survived, the line would continue. Always two, no more, no less. And now, that line flowed through her sharp, silent, waiting. She stood on the edge of a world without name. Stars scattered above her, the Force humming like distant thunder. And for the first time in her life, she was not looking forward. She was looking down, at the galaxy beneath her feet, and all the futures waiting to kneel. Cognus never spoke of Zannah again, not to her allies, not to the Force, not even to the apprentice she had not yet chosen, because to speak of the one who came before is to invite doubt, and the rule of two does not look backward. It replaces. Cognus began to speak with a different tone, now slower, deeper, without hesitation. Her voice had once been shaped by obedience. Now it shaped others. It filled the space that Zannah once held, but it did not mimic her. She did not preserve. She evolved. She used Zannah's knowledge, but not her methods. She retained Bane's principles, but not his fury. She stood at the center of two legacies and chose her own. Because that is what the Sith must do, continue the line, without becoming its prisoner. She meditated differently now, not to hear, but to command. She no longer reached for the Force in search of vision. She summoned it to shape possibility. Her mind did not ask questions. It gave orders. And the dark side obeyed. The galaxy remained unaware. The Jedi sensed no disturbance. The Senate debated endlessly. But far from the core, on forgotten worlds and in ruined halls, Cognus rebuilt the future. Piece by piece, not through power, through patience. She began to watch the galaxy again the way she once did as a seer, long before she understood what she was. But this time, she didn't look for signs of war or chaos. She looked for candidates, acolytes, children, fragments of darkness scattered across space, not strong enough yet to draw the Jedi's attention, but ripe for shaping. She would find one, teach one, mold them the way she had been molded, in silence, in trial, in truth, but only when the time was right. Until then, she spoke only to the Force, and the Force listened. She whispered not her thoughts, but her will. She did not plead, she did not chant. She spoke with finality, with weight. And in that stillness, the dark side shifted not away from her, but around her, as if it too had chosen. There was no prophecy in her rise, no chosen path, no ancient bloodline or stolen destiny, only clarity. Cognus was not born to become Sith. She became Sith because she refused to be anything else. Because her silence was deeper than Zannah's doubt. Because her patience was stronger than Bane's rage. Because when the time came to speak, she spoke with truth. I am the Sith. No title, no performance, just presence. And that voice, once hidden behind obedience, now carried across space, across generations. It did not echo in temples, it did not ring through war. It whispered, and the galaxy would hear it soon. The next apprentice would feel it first, not in a dream, but in the air. A weight, a pull, a quiet command with no words. The voice of Cognus, the voice that replaced her. Because in the end, every Sith is a shadow of the one before until they become the darkness itself. And now, she was the darkness, waiting, watching, listening for the one who would one day kneel, and the one who would one day rise. He was not the strongest she had seen, not the most ruthless, not the most gifted in combat, but he was the most dangerous, because he believed something no Sith ever should, that the Force had a will. She found him on Dromund Kaas, a boy raised among cults and broken teachings, touched by whispers in the dark. His potential was unmistakable. Even before he spoke, Cognus could feel it, a disturbance in his presence, like a fracture waiting to split open. He wasn't lost. He was unfinished. And so she watched. She tested him without revealing her true nature. Left trails of temptation, opportunities to seize power, invitations to cruelty. He accepted each one without hesitation, but not with hunger, with certainty. He believed he was chosen, that the Force had revealed something to him, something hidden from the Sith, a truth buried beneath thousands of years of misinterpretation. Cognus should have turned away. She didn't. She offered him a path, a name, Darth Millennial. He accepted it with no fear, no questions, only faith. At first, he listened, trained in her shadow, learned the ancient codes, studied the sorcery Zannah had passed down. He surpassed every challenge with clarity, but Cognus felt it, the silence between his steps, the calm that wasn't patience, but conviction. He did not serve her. He followed something else. The signs were small. He meditated alone, for hours, murmuring words that weren't Sith. He asked questions about prophecy, about destiny, about the will of the Force. Cognus corrected him. There is no will, she told him. There is only power, and those who take it. He listened. He nodded, but he didn't agree. She saw it in his eyes, a storm gathering behind belief. One night, he told her of a vision. He saw the galaxy ruled not by two, but by many, a dark council, dozens of Sith working together in harmony, not devouring each other, not hiding in shadows, building something permanent. Delusion, Cognus said. It's the future, he answered. She should have ended it then, but she didn't, because something in his words reminded her of herself. The girl who had once dreamed of fire, who had seen too far, too soon, who had been told to obey, but chose to wait. Millennial was different. He didn't wait, and he would not bow. Even as her apprentice, he held himself like an equal, not in arrogance, in faith. He believed the rule of two was a mistake, a wound, a prison crafted by Bane's fear. Cognus tried to correct him, not with punishment, but with history. She showed him what happened when the Sith grew too many. The collapse of the Brotherhood, the Jedi purge that followed. He listened, and said, "Then we must be better than they were." She felt it, then the gap that would never close. He did not want to destroy her. He wanted to outgrow her. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Sith do not grow together. They grow apart, until one is strong enough to cut the other down. Millennial would not do it. And Cognus would not wait forever. Their time was running out, not with war, but with belief. And in that quiet, the rule of two began to tremble. The Sith taught that visions were tools, nothing more. They were to be questioned, dissected, and used, never followed. But Millennial followed them. He began to speak less of power and more of prophecy. Not the kind found in Sith texts or ancient holocrons, but ones that came to him in sleep. Waking dreams, moments of silence where the Force pulled him inward. Cognus saw it happening, not as a sudden fall, but a quiet drift. One morning, he emerged from meditation and said 5 words. "I've seen the end, Master." She asked him to explain. He didn't. Instead, he described a place far beyond the outer rim, where stars burned purple and gravity bent like breath. A place the Sith had never touched. He claimed he had seen it in a vision. A throne not made of stone or steel, but light. And waiting beside it a figure in black, a dark messiah, the one who would end the cycle. Cognus listened, but said nothing. She remembered the stories Bane had passed to Zannah, the ones Zannah had passed to her, of Sith who lost themselves in symbols, who traded clarity for myth. She warned Millennial, there is no prophecy, only choice. He didn't argue. He just smiled. It's already been chosen. In the days that followed, he began drawing symbols into the walls of their shelter spirals, spires, figures with many arms. Not Sith runes, something older, something foreign. He called it the future. She called it heresy. But she didn't stop him. Not yet. Because part of her wanted to know how far he would go. How deep the Force would let him fall. He spoke of rebuilding the Sith not through destruction, but through belief. A unified order, guided not by the rule of two, but by prophecy, by the will of the Force itself. He began to gather followers, quietly, through messages carried by droids and whispers in the underworld. Cultists, exiles, failed Jedi. He promised them a new path. Not as Sith, as prophets. Cognus watched it all unfold. She let it happen. Not because she agreed, but because she needed to be sure. And one night, when he returned from a long silence, he said something that made her still. "I don't need to replace you." She turned. "I already have," he said. It wasn't a challenge. It was a farewell. That was the moment she knew. He had walked too far to return. His path was no longer curved toward the rule. It curved toward something else. A doctrine built on visions instead of victory. On submission instead of strength. A dark reflection of the Jedi Order, one that bowed to destiny instead of bending it. She didn't ignite her saber. Not yet, because Millennial didn't want to fight. He wanted to leave. And that was worse. Not failure. Deviation. The rule could survive betrayal. But divergence was wrought. And it had already begun. She had killed without hesitation. Zannah, her masters before her, even the voices that once lived in her mind silenced when they no longer served. Cognus had survived not through strength alone, but through clarity. She never waited too long, never gave mercy to those who outlived their purpose. But now, she hesitated. Millennial stood at the edge of their path, facing away. He had not drawn his weapon, had not made a threat. He simply stood there calm, expectant as if already knowing what she would decide. And that terrified her more than a blade ever could. She had prepared to kill him, prepared to end him cleanly, without regret. But as she watched him breathe not with fear, but serenity, something deeper stirred. He was not broken. He was becoming. And not in her image, not in the rules, in his own. That was the danger. He was not failing as a Sith. He was becoming something else entirely. And Cognus had to decide. The rule demanded that she end him, that she destroy what she could not control. But another voice whispered, not Zannah's, not Bane's, her own, and it asked a question she had never considered. What if she let him go? Not in weakness, in design. What if allowing him to live wasn't a mistake, but a path? She watched him leave. He didn't speak, didn't look back, and she didn't stop him. Not with words, not with a strike, just silence. She stood there long after his presence faded from the Force, replaying every step, every word he had spoken. Not to find justification, to understand her own choice. She hadn't failed. She had chosen. And in that choice, she rewrote the rule. Not by replacing it, by testing it. Millennial had not been her enemy. He had been her measure. And in letting him go, she had passed her own trial, not of strength, but of control. She would not chase him, because she knew what would happen. He would gather followers. He would create a doctrine of prophecy, the prophets of the dark side, a sect that claimed to see the future, but forgot how to survive the present. And in time, they would crumble, not through battle, through belief. Because the galaxy does not belong to visionaries. It belongs to those who endure. Cognus returned to her solitude. She did not take another apprentice. Not immediately. She waited, because patience was her first weapon, and clarity was her last. She did not regret letting him go, but she never forgave him either, because in his departure, he had shown her something she hadn't wanted to see. The rule of two could bend, but once bent, it would never be quite the same again. There was no record of the day he left, no mention in archives, no Sith holocron etched with his name, no death to mark his exit, only silence. And that silence became part of the rule. Cognus never spoke of Darth Millennial again, not to the Force, not to history, not even to herself, because acknowledging him would have meant acknowledging the truth, that the rule had bent and she hadn't stopped it. She told herself it was strategy, that she had seen further, chosen survival over confrontation, that Millennial's path would circle back into the dark, or vanish into failure. And yet, he lived. He thrived. Not as a Sith, but as something else. A prophet. A founder of a sect that whispered new visions. That spoke of destiny not as power to seize, but as a path already laid. The prophets of the dark side would grow slowly, hidden in the cracks of forgotten worlds. They would never challenge the Sith. But they would never need to, because their very existence was a fracture, a line branching away from the blade, a choice left uncut. Cognus continued as if nothing had changed. She resumed her rituals, continued seeking her next apprentice. She meditated, trained, waited. But something deep in the dark had shifted. The rule of two had always been absolute. Two, and only two, a master and an apprentice. No cults, No councils, no visions, no splinters. Just the line, unbroken, until now. And yet, the galaxy didn't notice, the Force didn't scream, the stars didn't fall, because cracks don't shatter all at once. They widened slowly, and Cognus felt it. She was still Sith, still Master. But the line was no longer straight. It had curved just slightly into shadow. She could have hunted him, could have sent assassins, could have tried to burn his name from history before it ever took root. But she didn't, because part of her still believed she had made the right choice. And that belief became her flaw. She told herself that the rule had endured worse, that the galaxy was still blind to the Sith, that no one, not even the Jedi, had sensed a change. But the rule of two isn't measured by what is seen. It's measured by what is allowed, and she had allowed divergence. Not in ignorance, but in silence. That was her legacy. Not weakness, not failure, but a quiet shift felt only by those who studied the edge of truth. She found another apprentice eventually, a quieter one, more obedient, more afraid, but something in her had changed. She trained him well, sharpened his mind, hardened his will, but she watched him more closely, and trusted him less, because now, she knew, the danger wasn't betrayal, it was belief. And once it starts, it doesn't always die with you. She saw it before it happened, not in vision, not in prophecy, but in behavior. Darth Millennial had already left her in truth, long before he ever walked away in body. The moment he chose prophecy over power, belief over clarity, that was the moment the rule fractured. And she had let it happen. Cognus remembered standing in silence, watching him speak to figures who would one day become his followers. Not Sith, not Jedi, not even Force warriors, just believers, lost minds seeking meaning in the darkness. He gave it to them, with words stolen from Sith doctrine, twisted into shape. He taught that the Force had intent, that the rule of two was not a law, but a phase, a wound that needed healing. He promised them destiny. He promised them unity. He promised them a galaxy ruled not by strength, but by revelation. Cognus heard all of it, and still, she let him go. Some would call it weakness, others, failure, but she called it something else. A cut, surgical, precise, controlled. She knew what he would build. She knew the consequences. And still, she did not strike. Not because she couldn't, because she chose not to. He had already stopped being Sith. Killing him wouldn't have restored the rule. It would have made her a reactionary. And that was not who she was. Instead, she watched the line bend, and planned how to straighten it. The prophets of the dark side were born not in violence, but in echo. They didn't scream, they whispered. From outer moons, from lost systems, from ruined temples the Sith had long abandoned. They dressed in dark robes, masked their identities, spoke in riddles. And yet, none of them wielded true power. Only illusion, only prediction. They became known across the galaxy as mystics, advisors to warlords, cult leaders who sold visions in exchange for loyalty. They saw the future. They claimed to understand the will of the Force, but they didn't command it, only feared it. And that was their mistake. Millennial had turned away from the rule of two, to build something lesser, a mirror, fogged by hope. Cognus could have crushed them early, sent her next apprentice to erase them, lit the stars with fire. But she didn't, because she was listening and waiting. The rule had been damaged, not destroyed. Its shape had changed, but not its purpose. Two still remained, master and heir, and she still held both titles. The break had come, and it was her fault, but not her end. She would not bury it, would not hide from it. She would study it, and learn how to seal the fracture from within. Because Sith doctrine is not static, it moves, and now it had moved through her, bending without breaking. They gathered in silence, not with armies or fleets, but with robes and riddles, with promises of answers too large to name. The prophets of the dark side never declared war. They didn't need to. They weren't built for conquest. They were built for belief, and in that belief, they grew. Cognus watched them stretch across forgotten moons and black market halls. She saw their symbols etched into rusted doors, their followers chanting beneath twin suns, their teachings whispered into the ears of warlords and governors alike. They never called themselves Sith. That was how they survived, but every truth they claimed had been born from her, and from the rule they now refused to name. They preached that the Force had chosen them, that the old ways were crumbling, that Darth Millennial had seen the death of the rule of two not in battle, but in time, that their future would not come through bloodlines or blades, but through prophecy. And the galaxy listened, not because the prophets were powerful, but because they were patient. Cognus could feel them, always just beyond her reach, not hiding, echoing, shaping culture from the shadows, feeding the idea that the dark side didn't need limits. That structure was fear. That destiny was louder than doctrine. Her apprentices asked about them. She told them nothing, because even acknowledging them gave them more weight. And yet, she didn't erase them, not because she couldn't, but because she understood what they were. A branch, a deviation, but not the trunk. The rule of two remained hidden, hardened, pure in purpose, its chain of succession intact. Every true Sith that followed her came from the blade, not the vision. The prophets didn't stop that. They distracted from it. And that was useful. Cognus saw what others missed, that while the Jedi searched the stars for dark armies and violent uprisings, the prophets became the distraction, and the Sith became invisible again. That was the irony. The heresy that should have broken everything had bought her time. Time to train. Time to pass on the rule in silence. Time to endure. So she let the prophets spread. Not unchecked, just uncaught. She let them build their temples on the edges of space, while she sharpened the blade in the core. She let them believe they were the future, while she trained the one who would outlast them all. It was not forgiveness. It was design. Millennial had fled her teaching, but his cult had unknowingly served it. They taught the galaxy to expect weakness in shadows, so when the real darkness rose, no one would see it coming, and that was her revenge. Not through fire, but through forgetting. She didn't kill the cult. She buried it beneath irrelevance. Because the prophets didn't hold the future. They only borrowed her past. The rule of two was never perfect. It was brutal, elegant, cold, but never pure. Cognus had known that from the beginning, even as she knelt to Zannah, even as she whispered the Sith code into the dust of Ambria. It was never a doctrine of truth. It was a blade forged out of desperation. Bane had created it not because it was ideal, but because everything else had failed. The Brotherhood fell. The legions turned on themselves, and in that chaos, the rule was born. Not as philosophy, as survival, but over time, it became more than that. More than a structure. It became a myth. Each master passing the rule forward, cloaking it in reverence, as if it had always been perfect, as if betrayal and blood were part of a sacred rite. Cognus had followed that myth for years. She'd upheld it, killed for it, buried Zannah beneath it. And yet, when Millennial walked away, it didn't break. It bent, and she saw the lie for what it was. The rule had never been pure. It had only ever been protected. Protected by silence, by fear, by precision, by those who enforced it without question, and punished all who dared to stray. But in truth, it had always been fragile, held together by secrecy and conviction. And that meant it could adapt. Cognus didn't abandon the rule. She refined it. She stripped away the myth and faced it as it truly was, a system that worked because someone had the clarity to make it work. Not because the Force had written it, not because Bane was a prophet, but because the Sith needed order. And fear alone wasn't enough. Not anymore. She began shaping her next apprentice differently. Not with prophecy, not with reverence, but with reason. She explained the rule's origin, not as legend, but as reaction. She taught them not to worship the blade, but to understand its weight, to know when to use it, and when to let it rest. She spoke of Millennial only once, not with anger, but as example. A strong apprentice, she said, but strength without structure is just noise. The apprentice asked why she let him live. Cognus stared through the silence, to see what the rule could become when left behind. That was the lesson. Not obedience, but clarity. The rule didn't survive because it was pure. It survived because she had kept it alive. And one day, her apprentice would have to do the same. Not through memory, but through choice. Cognus no longer pretended the rule was eternal. She knew better. Everything ends, even doctrine. But not today. Because today, the rule still lived. Through her voice, through her air, through the quiet decisions no one else would ever know. And if her legacy was not purity, then it would be honesty. The Sith do not need perfection. They need survival. The rule had changed, but it had not ended. Cognus understood now legacy was not about preservation. It was about pressure. What endured did so because someone held it together long enough to reshape it. Not in defiance of tradition, but in service to it. She had become that pressure. And so, she reforged the Sith in silence. There were no declarations, no symbols redesigned, no grand proclamations of reform. Only small shifts, quiet adjustments, the kind of changes that only mattered when seen across decades. She trained her apprentice with precision, but also with truth. No illusions, no fables of Sith perfection. She showed them the failures, the betrayals, the moments the line almost snapped. And then she showed them how it held. She taught them to observe, to question, to wait, but most of all, to continue, because that was the only measure of power that mattered. Not strength, endurance. The cult of the prophets faded in time. Their influence dulled, their numbers thinned. They became what all offshoots become: background, a curiosity, but the Sith remained, two at a time, one to hold power, one to take it. And when her apprentice was ready, Cognus did what Zannah had once done for her. She stepped back, not to surrender, but to test, because the rule, as she had reforged it, required more than victory. It required clarity. Her apprentice failed the first trial, survived the second, and on the third, proved worthy. Cognus bled, but did not fall. Not yet, because even in pain, she saw the next step. Not the end of her story, but the survival of the line. And so she taught again, with fewer words, with deeper silence, and one day she would fall, not in shame, but in sequence. That was the legacy she had saved, not through fire, not through prophecy, but through stillness. She had taken the fracture left by millennial and sealed it with patience. She had allowed divergence, without losing direction. And in doing so, she had become more than a survivor. She had become a keeper, not of relics, but of the long, unbroken truth. The Sith do not endure because they are many. They endure because someone, somewhere, remembers what must be done. Cognus remembered, and when her time finally came, she would not hesitate, because she had already seen the future once. And this time, she had helped build it. She had once been a weapon, a silent hand in the dark, an assassin shaped by fear and foresight. But Cognus was no longer that. She had outlived her old self, outlived Zannah, outlived millennial's heresy. Now, she was something else, a keeper. The galaxy didn't notice her anymore. That suited her. She moved through space not as a name, but as a shadow between names. Planets changed governments. Warlords came and fell. The Jedi faded into myth, and then into war, and then into myth again. And still, she endured, not to lead, not to conquer, but to protect the fire. The rule of two was no longer an edge to her, it was an ember. Small, quiet, always at risk of vanishing, but still alive, still warm, still hers to carry forward. And so she did. Cognus chose her next apprentice the way one chooses where to build a fire in the wind carefully. She ignored the loud, the violent, the prodigies. She searched for the ones who listened before they spoke, and she found them, one by one. Some were too weak, some too angry, but a few understood. Not the rule itself that came later, but the burden, that the Sith had to remain hidden. Patient, focused not on victory, but on survival. Cognus trained each of them differently. Some with discipline, some with fear, some she tested without warning, forcing them to face failure without instruction. Because that's how the fire survives, not by burning brightly, but by burning through the night. She never stayed in one place long. Her path stretched across the outer rim and beyond. She built safe houses that no one would ever find, temples beneath caves, vaults buried under nameless moons. And in each one, she left pieces of the legacy, fragments of the code, traces of alchemy, writings only a Sith could decipher, not for herself, for those who would come after. She was building a trail, one so faint that only someone worthy would ever follow it. Because one day, she knew, her line might break. She might be killed. Her apprentice might fail. The rule might flicker. But the fire would still be waiting. Cognus no longer lived with urgency. She no longer believed in destiny or doom. She believed in continuity. Quiet, painful, invisible continuity. The kind the galaxy never thanks you for, but the kind that matters. Every so often, she felt the pull of the dark side surging somewhere, distant wars she did not start. Rival Sith cults chasing illusions. She ignored them. They would fade, the fire would not. Because she had chosen to protect it. Not as a warrior, not as a seer, but as a keeper. And in doing so, she became more than the rule. She became the reason it survived. Their names were never recorded. They left behind no tombs, no statues, no war-torn legends. No Jedi holocron ever mentioned them. No Sith archive ever confirmed they lived. But they did. Cognus trained them one by one, some for years, some for days. And then they were gone. These apprentices did not fail in combat. They failed in understanding. They treated the rule as a ladder, not a weight. They saw power as possession, not as passage. Cognus ended them, without cruelty, without pride, with the same calm she had carried since Ambria, the calm of someone who knew exactly what the rule demanded, and nothing more. They died nameless, unwritten, but not forgotten, because Cognus remembered them. Not with warmth, with clarity. Each apprentice taught her something about the limits of inheritance, that not all strength becomes legacy, that not every student becomes a shadow worth passing. Some burned too fast, others never burned at all. She once spent 5 years training one who showed perfect discipline, patient, precise, and quiet. But when tested, he hesitated. Only once. She ended him the same day. Another spoke constantly of destiny. She let him speak, listened as he imagined himself ruling over the stars. When she finally struck, he didn't raise his blade. He thought prophecy would protect him. It didn't. Each time, Cognus buried the past deeper, moved farther, taught less, because she began to see something that Zannah had once known, that knowledge could only be passed through fire. Not in words, not in scrolls, but in trial, in survival. So she began teaching through silence, letting the Force be the instructor, letting death be the curriculum. And only when her apprentice no longer needed her would she reveal what they had become. A Sith. There were brief successes, apprentices who endured longer, who resisted temptation, who understood the waiting. But none survived long enough to replace her. So she waited. And while she waited, the galaxy changed. The Jedi rose again, fell again. Worlds collapsed into memory. The Sith were called extinct. She smiled at that, because she was still here, still choosing, still remembering the ones who came before and the ones who never truly began. They weren't legends, but they mattered, because without them, she would never have learned how to teach, how to test, how to pass the fire forward without watching it burn out. Each forgotten apprentice sharpened her purpose, and that purpose was not conquest. It was continuity, because the Sith do not survive by being known. They survive by being remembered, even when their names are lost. Cognus carried those names in silence, and waited for the one who would earn their place among them, by surviving where the others fell. She stopped speaking the day her last apprentice fell, not out of grief, not out of anger, out of understanding. Words had limits. She had spent decades guiding voices that never listened, whispering truths to ears already filled with dreams. She had watched ambition outpace clarity, pride dissolve patience. So she chose silence, not as retreat, as refinement. The galaxy had grown louder in her time. More wars, more factions. Jedi, anti-Jedi, false Sith, pretenders with crimson blades and hollow convictions, all of them shouting across the stars, desperate to be heard. Cognus listened to none of it, because she didn't need to be loud. She only needed to last. The rule of two had not died. It had simply gone quiet. So she followed it deeper into the shadows. No titles, no planets to claim, no monuments to hold. Only purpose. She began traveling alone through systems untouched by the wars, empty places, dead moons, abandoned orbitals. She searched not for relics, but for time. The kind of time that reshapes a soul in silence. And in that silence, she began speaking only to the Force. Not in command, in communion, She asked for nothing. She gave it nothing. She simply existed in it, letting it show her what remained. She found ruins older than memory, Sith vaults buried in gravity wells, temples where the stone itself had forgotten its name. She sat among the broken walls and listened. And in that stillness, she remembered who she was. Not the huntress, not the seer, not the killer trained in fear, but the keeper, the last voice of a line that had never been allowed to rest. She did not need another apprentice yet. The time wasn't right, and so she waited. Not in idleness, but in preparation. She rebuilt her mind the way one sharpens a blade dulled from too much battle. She revisited every lesson from Zannah, every lie from Bane, every moment she had let the rule bend and nearly break. And then she forgave herself, because silence wasn't failure. It was readiness. She was no longer a master waiting to be challenged. She was a master who understood that the greatest strength was knowing when not to pass the torch, because unworthy hands destroy more than they inherit. So she spoke to no one, not even herself. She trained in darkness, ate in solitude, slept beside dead stars. And still, the rule lived. Because she lived. And that was enough. The next apprentice would come. Not today, not soon, but one day. And when they arrived, Cognus would speak again. Not to teach, to test. Because by then, the silence would have become sacred. And only the one who could walk through it without fear would deserve to hear her voice. There were years when the Sith were believed to be extinct. Centuries, even. Entire generations of Jedi walked the halls of Coruscant, sure that the dark side had been buried, burned away with the last war. They spoke of peace like it was permanent, of victory like it had roots. They were wrong, because while they spoke, Cognus remained. She moved like time itself, invisible, quiet, unstoppable. No records traced her. No sightings confirmed her. She passed through eras the way a shadow passes over sand, gone before it could be named, and the rule endured. Sometimes she whispered it to herself beneath dying stars. Sometimes she carved it into stone no one would ever read. Always two, one to hold power, one to crave it, but for long stretches of time, she remained the only one. And still, she waited. Because legacy does not live in numbers. It lives in rhythm. And the Sith's rhythm had slowed, not ended. The galaxy turned. Empires rose. Republics fell. New Jedi. New enemies. New wars. She watched them all, never interfering, never reaching, just observing and remembering. She buried Sith knowledge in vaults forgotten by the stars, left traps for the unworthy, left trails for the brave. She etched parts of the code into the bones of derelict stations. She rewired holocrons to activate only under fear. She wasn't building a legacy. She was scattering one. Because the Sith don't build temples for the galaxy to find. They build puzzles. And only the one who solves them deserves to kneel. She changed names, changed faces, became myths in local systems, ghosts in trader rumors, a witch in the woods, a stranger in red armor, a hooded figure on a moon that didn't rotate. She was all of them, and none of them, because the name Cognus had never been hers to keep. It had always been borrowed. And when the time came, she would give it back to the dark. But until then, she moved through time like breath, soft, endless, unnoticed. The rule of two was not her prison. It was her spine. And even as stars died, and maps were rewritten, and memories of Bane, Zannah, millennial faded into dust, the fire still burned. Because she kept it, not with fury, but with silence. She had outlived every voice that had tried to define her. And now, she spoke only through the rule itself. The final truth, the quiet law, the unseen weight carried through extinction, through time, and when her apprentice finally arrived, they would not find her, they would feel her, in the teachings left behind, in the shadows beneath their thoughts, in the fear that told them they were not the first. Because Cognus had been there, before, after, always. There is no grave, no ashes, no body, no battlefield, no funeral, no last words, only silence and absence, the kind that doesn't make a sound, but leaves something colder in its place. Darth Cognus did not die as a warrior. She did not fall in the arms of an apprentice. No monument was built. No lightsaber was passed. There is no final duel to replay. No betrayal to mourn. She was here, and then she wasn't. And that was the point. It was not failure. It was fulfillment. Because Cognus understood something the Sith rarely did. Something even Bane, for all his cruelty and vision, never fully embraced. The rule of two was not about power. It was about transition. It was about subtraction, not multiplication. And when her time came, she obeyed, quietly. The last true master of the line once forged in fire, who had outlived rebellion, heresy, and extinction, chose to vanish. Not from fear, but from clarity. Because she had done what she was meant to do. She had chosen apprentices, lost some, guided others. She had witnessed the birth of false Sith orders and watched them collapse under their own noise. She had kept the flame alive in caves, in ruins, in whispers. And then, when the fire was steady, she walked away, not into retirement, into legend. The kind of legend no one remembers, the kind that doesn't carry a name or a face, only a shape in the dark, a pressure in the Force, a warning that something once lived there. She did not leave a holocron. She did not seal herself in stasis. She did not chase eternity through rituals or transfer essence, because Cognus never wanted to live forever. She only wanted the rule to. And so, she became the last thing a Sith could be. Free. No longer bound to legacy. No longer haunted by prophecy. No longer required to watch the galaxy burn and rebuild itself in cycles of illusion. She had passed the test not because she had survived, but because she had known when to stop surviving. There are fragments, of course. Unconfirmed sightings on dead moons. Ancient markings in Sith dialect carved into derelict stations. Whispered references to a red-eyed woman in unknown Jedi scrolls. A few even say that Darth Plagueis, the Sith Lord who would one day teach Darth Sidious, learned some of his earliest doctrine not from his master, but from an artifact older than the Banite line should have allowed. A trace of her voice. A trace of her mind, but not her. Never her, because she wasn't meant to be found, and she didn't want to be. The rule had to be protected, not as scripture, not as dogma, but as rhythm. One master, one apprentice, no exceptions, no spectacle, and no names. Cognus wasn't like Bane. She did not crave to be the first remembered. She chose to be the last forgotten. A protector of a law older than most stars. She watched the galaxy move on without her republics rising, falling, Jedi returning to arrogance, darkness finding new forms in other orders, other cults. But none of them held what she had carried. None of them could. Because Cognus had purified the line through sacrifice. Not blood, but silence. The galaxy would look for monsters. It always did. It needed loud enemies, obvious tyrants. She gave it none. she let them forget her. And in doing so, she guaranteed that her successor, whoever they were, would never be hunted too early. That was her final gift, a clear path forward, shaped not by her hand, but by her absence. And that is why her death is not recorded, because it wasn't a death, it was a choice. The final application of control, the last lesson in patience. Not even Sidious, the ultimate product of the rule, would know her name, but her breath would be in every decision he made, her shadow in every betrayal, her silence behind every scream, because she had been the bridge between collapse and rebirth. She had watched the fire nearly go out, and then let go. Not in despair, but in certainty. She was never found, because she didn't want to be, because she didn't need to be, because she already was, exactly where she was meant to be, gone, and still everywhere. Cognus did not survive by accident. She survived by design. Every decision she made, every apprentice chosen, every silence held, every retreat into the void was a move carved into the foundation of the Sith. She wasn't preserving a person. She was preserving a pattern. And that pattern had rules. Not just the rule of two. Not just the law of one master and one apprentice. But deeper rules, ones never spoken aloud. The Sith must be invisible. The Sith must be inevitable. And the Sith must endure. Cognus embodied all three. While the galaxy spiraled into louder wars, louder empires, louder collapses, she stayed in the quiet places. She lived in the pauses between legends, not as a fugitive, not as a coward, as a patient guardian of something older than power. She understood what the Jedi never did, that the Force didn't belong to peace or war. It belonged to time. And time always favored those who didn't rush it. So she waited, and she watched. The Jedi believed they had won, that the Sith had ended with Bane, that their ancient enemies had been erased at last. They called the rule of two a failed heresy. They wrote their histories as if it had never worked, but they were wrong, because it had worked exactly as intended. They couldn't see her, because she didn't want to be seen. And her apprentice, whoever they were, learned to wear the same mask. The rule didn't need armies. It didn't need temples. It didn't even need victories. It only needed one thing: continuity. Cognus built that continuity not with power, but with restraint. She learned from Bane's arrogance, from Zannah's cruelty, from Millennial's betrayal. She saw the cracks in their convictions, the places where their rage became weakness. She let go of all of it. She stopped defining herself by pain and started defining herself by control. Real control, not domination over others, but over herself, her fear, her desire, her impulse to act when waiting was better. She became the Sith Bane could not be. The Sith Zannah would not become. She didn't try to change the rule. She let the rule change her. Over time, she shed the remnants of her old life. The huntress, the seer, the assassin, all of them were masks. All of them were tools for an earlier stage, but not anymore. Now she was simply the rule's servant. Its vessel. Its keeper. Her lightsaber remained untouched for years. Not because she had grown weak, but because she didn't need it. Conflict had become irrelevant. The real war was against time, against corruption of the line. And so she refined herself the way metal is folded, over and over. She studied Sith rituals not for their spectacle, but for their function. She revisited forgotten worlds, Malachor, Thule, Korriban, not to claim them, but to understand why they had fallen. She studied the ruins of failure. She let them speak, and they all told her the same thing. The Sith were never defeated by Jedi. They were defeated by themselves, by noise, by ego, by spectacle. So, she became the opposite. A shadow, but a purposeful one. She was not hiding, she was shaping, quietly, meticulously. She stripped the doctrine down to its bones, removed the ornament, removed the pride, removed the emotion. What remained was survival. And survival was not a reaction. It was an art. Cognus mastered that art, and when she looked to the future through the currents of the Force, through the shifting patterns of destiny, she saw that survival meant not being seen, not being named, not being feared, until it was too late. She accepted that her place in the grand story would be no place at all. She would be a gap in the record, a missing link between monsters. And that was exactly what the Sith needed, because monsters die, but patterns endure, and she had become the pattern. Not a name, not a legacy, a function. The galaxy forgot her. Historians erased her. The Jedi never spoke of her again. And when future Sith Lords rose, Plagueis, Sidious, Vader, none of them mentioned Cognus. But all of them followed her, whether they knew it or not, because she had shaped the narrow path that made them possible. She had been the space between destruction and resurgence. She had been the form of survival, the shape no one could see, but everyone would one day feel. Every Sith who came after walked through a door she left open, but none of them saw her standing there. Not Plagueis, who searched the galaxy for secrets that had already been mastered. Not Sidious, who believed he was the culmination of 1,000 years of dark design. Not Maul, not Tyrannus, not even Vader. They thought they were forging destiny, but they were following a path she buried beneath them. Cognus was never meant to be remembered. She wasn't the origin. She was the glue. The quiet soul who stood between collapse and creation, not with fire but with discipline, not with vision but with silence. She was the ghost beneath greatness. And every time a Sith rose high enough to shake the stars, they did so standing on her shoulders. But they never looked down. Perhaps it was better that way. Because she didn't want recognition. She didn't want devotion. She didn't need credit. She had outgrown that centuries ago. Even her apprentices, if there were any after Millennial, would never truly know her. She would be there in the dark, shaping them, teaching them, not through affection, but through pattern. Because Sith don't raise successors. They test them, and when the time came, they vanish. She had seen it in Bane. She had seen it in Zannah. She had learned it deeply. The apprentice must believe they've outgrown the master. The master must let them believe it, and then disappear. Cognus played that part flawlessly, which is why her name faded. But her fingerprints did not. The rule of two remained intact, unbroken, uncompromised. Through millennia of galactic violence, betrayal, Jedi victories, and endless wars, the lineage of Bane endured because she had made herself into a hidden wall. No apprentice had to rebuild the order, because she never let it fall. She asked nothing in return. No statues, no records, no vengeance, just continuity. Plagueis spoke of the Sith line as if it had passed unbroken, and it had, but only because she refused to let history erase its structure. Even when others walked away, even when doctrine was threatened, even when apprentices disobeyed, she kept the door closed behind them. No light escaped, no witnesses remained. When Sidious eventually came, full of fire and vision and monstrous control, he didn't realize he was walking a road paved by someone who never demanded anything of him. Because Cognus didn't build the future, she held it in place, quietly, painfully, perfectly. She had felt the pull of ambition. She had seen herself, once, as the next Dark Empress, a destroyer of Jedi, a queen of death. But that wasn't the rule, and the rule had changed her. It had crushed her ego. It had stripped her title. It had reminded her, again and again, that power without order leads to collapse. So she buried her greatness. And when new Sith emerged, she let them think they had invented their doctrine. She let them believe they were original. That was her sacrifice, to vanish so completely that her influence could never be corrupted by fame. Because she knew the truth. Greatness that needs to be seen doesn't last. Only the quiet endures. And she had become very quiet. The Sith triumvirate had ruled worlds and screamed their philosophies into the stars. The Brotherhood of Darkness had marched in legions, chanting their names. Even Bane had spoken of his vision with pride. Cognus said nothing. She did everything, and said nothing. Because legacy is not what survives history books. Legacy is what shapes things no one can trace. She was never seen standing beside Plagueis, but he followed her path. She was never named in the journals of Sidious, but he reaped the fruits of her boundaries. She was never blamed for the Empire, but she was its architect, in a way no one could understand. Because she didn't build it with hands. She built it with rules. She was the memory inside the muscle, the ghost in the technique, the code in the blood. And no matter how many empires fell, how many Sith screamed their names in fury, how many Jedi temples burned, her silence remained, watching, waiting, not to intervene, only to witness. And through that quiet, watching, she shaped them all. She was not a figure in their story. She was the story they didn't know they were in. The ghost beneath greatness. In the end, she became what the rule demanded. Not a Sith, not a legend, not even a name, just a function. Cognus was not buried, at least not in any tomb that history remembers. There is no known world that holds her bones. No holocron that preserves her voice. No apprentice who spoke her final words. It is as if she dissolved into the dark. Not from weakness, but from fulfillment. Because the rule of two did not promise glory. It promised survival. And she gave it everything. She had once believed in visions. As a child on Iktoch, they had haunted her. The futures that came without warning. The screams, the blood, the faces she hadn't met yet. She thought they meant she would be great, that destiny had chosen her. But destiny did not speak in dreams. It whispered in choices, in the quiet ones no one sees. And over a long, unspoken life, Cognus made those choices. She did not burn bright. She burned long. The Jedi, in their robes and temples, never felt her hand pass through their history. They thought the Sith extinct. They thought peace was real. But she was still there. Every time a temple fell, her design had shaped the hand that struck it. Every time a dark apprentice rose, her teachings echoed behind their anger. She was not their leader. She was their context. And no one ever knew. She would have liked it that way. Her apprentices, whoever came after Millennial, were shaped by a doctrine cleaner than any before. She had burned away the distractions, the greed, the spectacle, the hatred. The rituals remained, but they were not worship. They were discipline, meditation, suffering turned inward. The rule had become lean, sharp. It no longer needed a face. It needed obedience. And she gave it. No monument bears her mark, but her rules still hold. One master, one apprentice, no exceptions. The apprentice must crave power. The master must hold it. until they fall, and the stronger one rises. That was all she became, the rule, and nothing more. Cognus did not fear death. She had seen it too often. In visions, in war, in Zannah's silence, in Millennial's departure. She had walked among tombs older than recorded history, and felt no awe. Death was not the enemy. Forgetfulness was. So she made sure to be forgotten the right way. Not erased, absorbed. She would not leave behind a story. She would leave behind a path, and others would walk it. They would fall, they would rise, they would believe they were the first, or the last, or the greatest. But it wouldn't matter, because she was still there. In every strike, in every betrayal, in every whisper passed from master to apprentice across generations. The quiet architect, the Sith who became nothing, so that the Sith could become everything. It's possible she died alone. It's possible her final apprentice killed her. It's possible she chose to fade without challenge. No one knows. No one needs to. Because that's what she became. The rule, perfected. No voice, no story, just continuation. When Sidious stood above the galaxy and declared the return of the Sith, he was standing on her foundation. When Vader broke the Jedi Order with fire and pain, he was swinging a blade sharpened by her silence. Even when they broke the rule, when Sidious took more than one apprentice, when he clung to life past his time, they did so in rebellion against her clarity. And they paid the price. The Empire fell. The Sith were shattered, because they forgot her discipline, and her legacy remains only in the Sith who remember what she truly was. Not a hunter, not a sorcerer, not a prophet, not a name, just the fire between torches, the thread between generations, the hand that passed the rule forward. And when her memory fades from every record, when her story ends without conclusion, she wins, because the rule survives. And that is all she ever wanted.